Amara was carrying a basket of wet laundry across the yard when she heard her stepmother's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. She did not stop walking. She had learned, over 6 years, that stopping only made things worse. If she paused, Vivian would notice her pausing, and then the words would sharpen and multiply until Amara felt as though she were standing in a hailstorm with nothing to cover her head. So she kept moving, her bare feet pressing into the cool earth, her eyes fixed on the clothesline at the far end of the garden. The voice followed her anyway. "She is 22 years old," Vivian was saying, loud enough to reach across the yard, and probably beyond the gate. 22, and not one man has looked at her twice. What does that tell you? Amara clipped a shirt to the line. She did not know who Vivian was speaking to. It could have been the neighbor woman, Mrs. Hartley, who liked to lean over the low fence in the early mornings to trade gossip before the day warmed up. It could have been one of Vivian's daughters, Caroline or Grace, both of whom had inherited their mother's talent for cruelty dressed up as concern. It did not matter. The audience changed. The words never did. "No man is going to want a girl like that," Vivian continued. "She has nothing. No charm, no conversation. You put her in a room full of people and she disappears. I have tried with her, I really have. But there is only so much a person can do." Amara clipped another shirt to the line. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, slowly, the way she had taught herself to do. Her hands were steady. She had made her hands steady through years of practice, and she was proud of that, even if she was proud of almost nothing else about herself anymore. The steadiness of her hands was something Vivian had not been able to take from her. She thought about her mother. Her mother had been dead for 8 years now, and the memory of her was both a comfort and a pain that Amara carried the way some people carry an old wound, something that had healed wrong and still ached on cold mornings. Her mother's name had been Clara, and she had been a quiet woman, the kind of woman who expressed love not with many words but with small actions, with a cup of tea placed near your elbow when you were reading, with a hand smoothed over your hair when you were sad, with laughter that came easily and warmly, and filled a room without demanding anything in return. Clara had died when Amara was 14, and the silence she left behind was the kind that nothing could fill. Amara's father, George, was a good man in the way that some good men are good, deeply, quietly, and somewhat uselessly. He was a man who felt things strongly and acted on very few of them. He had loved Clara with a sincerity that was obvious, and, after her death, he had folded in on himself in a way that left Amara to grieve alone while also watching over him, making sure he ate, making sure he did not spend too many evenings sitting in the dark. For 2 years it had been just the two of them, and those 2 years, difficult as they were the years Amara remembered as the last truly peaceful ones. Then George had met Vivian. Vivian was a widow herself, which had seemed to recommend her to George in some way that Amara had never fully understood. She had 2 daughters, Caroline, who was 3 years older than Amara, and Grace, who was 1 year younger. She had a certain kind of energy that Amara later came to understand was not warmth but the performance of warmth. She smiled often, touched people's arms when she spoke to them, laughed at things that were not particularly funny. George had seemed to find this comforting, and Amara, watching from the edges, had tried to be fair. She had tried to remind herself that she was a teenager who had lost her mother and was not exactly in the best position to evaluate another person's heart fairly. She had given Vivian 6 months. By the end of those 6 months, she understood what she was living with. Vivian's performance of warmth was for people who could do something for her. Neighbors, friends of George's, visitors who came to the house. For Amara, there was no performance. There was just the cool, matter-of-fact management of someone she considered unnecessary. Amara was not insulted openly, not at first. The treatment was subtler than that. It was the way Vivian would consult Caroline and Grace about dinner but not ask Amara. It was the way visitors would be told about Caroline's achievements, about Grace's social life, and Amara's name would simply not come up. It was the way Amara's things gradually migrated to the smallest bedroom, the one at the back of the house with the window that looked onto the alley, while Caroline was given the bright room at the front. It was the accumulation of small things. The message they added up to was simple and consistent. You are not quite real here. Over the years, the message had grown louder. Amara finished hanging the laundry and picked up the empty basket. She walked back toward the house, and as she passed the side gate, she saw that Vivian was indeed speaking to Mrs. Hartley over the fence. Mrs. Hartley was nodding with the practiced sympathy of a woman who liked to hear about other people's difficulties. She did not notice Amara. Vivian noticed her, and something shifted in her expression, just slightly, a tightening around the eyes that could have been embarrassment or could have been satisfaction. Amara could never quite tell which it was, and she had given up trying. She went inside. The kitchen smelled of toast and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a house after the most talkative people in it have left the room. Caroline had gone to meet a friend. Grace was still upstairs, moving around in the way she always moved in the mornings, loudly and without apparent purpose. George had already left for the office. The kitchen was Amara's for a little while. She set the basket down and filled the kettle and stood at the window while it heated, watching the garden. The laundry moved gently in the morning wind. The roses her mother had planted along the eastern wall were beginning to open. Clara had loved roses, had spoken about them with a kind of reverence that Amara had absorbed without quite meaning to, and now the sight of them, every spring, was the clearest memory she had of her mother's voice. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with it, and for a few minutes she allowed herself to simply sit. This was the thing she had learned to value above almost everything else, small moments of stillness that belonged entirely to her. When the house was briefly quiet and nobody needed anything, and nobody was watching her, and she could exist without performing anything at all, not patience, not invisible acceptance, not the particular kind of stillness she wore in public that people sometimes mistook for serenity, but was actually just the face she put on over the things she could not say. She was not serene. She had never been serene. She was tired in the way that people get tired when they have been doing the same difficult thing for a very long time. Not dramatically tired, not the kind of tired that makes for a good story. Just quietly, persistently, bone-deep tired, in the way of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that they have forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. She finished her tea and rinsed the cup and went upstairs to make the beds. This was her morning. She made the beds, her own first, then the ones that would not be thanked for. Then she tidied the upstairs hallway and gathered the laundry that had been left on the bathroom floor and added it to the bag in the utility room. She did these things not because she was told to every morning, but because the pattern of them had become so established that she would not have known how to stop. The house ran in part because she ran it, and this fact was visible to no one, least of all Vivian, who organized the shopping and planned the meals but left the actual material management of the day to Amara as casually as she left a coat on a hook. There had been a period, years ago, when Amara had tried to talk to George about it. She had been 17, and the conversation had not gone well. Not because George was unkind, but because he was frightened. She had seen the fear in his face as she spoke. The fear of conflict, of imbalance, of being the person who had to choose between his daughter and the woman he had married. He had listened to everything she said, and then he had told her that he was sure things would improve, that Vivian meant well, that family was difficult sometimes and required patience. He had placed his hand over hers when he said it, and she had seen how sorry he was, and the sorrow had not been enough. She had not tried again. She kept a journal. She had been keeping one since she was 15, filling notebooks with the small details of her days, the conversations she had heard, the things she felt, the quiet observations she could not share with anyone. The journals were kept in a box under her bed, and they were the truest record of her, more accurate than the face she showed the household, more honest than the careful, measured way she moved through her life. In the journals, she was angry sometimes. She was angry more than she showed, and the journals held that anger safely, kept it from spilling out at the wrong moments in the wrong directions. She was also, in the journals, hopeful, in spite of everything. She wrote about the things she wanted, not extraordinary things, not the things of fairy stories, but ordinary things that should have been simple to reach and felt very far away. She wanted a room of her own that nobody moved her out of. She wanted to finish the reading course she had started at the local library. She wanted to have a conversation with someone who asked what she thought and genuinely waited for the answer. She wanted to wake up in a house where she was not a burden that nobody acknowledged but everyone felt. She knew these were not large wants. That was part of what made them hard to write down. They were small enough to make her feel foolish for wanting them, and still distant enough to make her ache. She went about her day. She swept the front steps and wiped down the bathroom tiles and checked that the water pressure in the downstairs tap was correct after the previous week's issue with the pipe. She did these things without being asked because there was no one else to do them, and because the house required them, and because she had, over the years, made herself indispensable in the practical sense, which was the only sense in which she had been allowed to be indispensable. The afternoon brought Grace downstairs with a request that was really a demand, delivered in the particular tone Grace used when she was pretending to ask. There was an event coming up, a garden party at the Finley house, a large property 2 streets over, owned by the Finley family, who were the sort of people about whom everyone in the neighborhood had opinions and with whom everyone in the neighborhood wanted to be on good terms. The party was in 4 days. Vivian had received an invitation, as had Caroline and Grace. Amara had not. She had not expected to. Grace was describing what she planned to wear, and asking Amara whether the blue dress had been properly ironed, or whether it still had the crease along the left side that Grace had complained about the previous time she wore it. Amara said she would look at the dress and iron it if needed. Grace said good, and went back upstairs without a pause in the story she was telling about someone at the party, someone she was looking forward to seeing, someone whose name Amara did not recognize. She was not expected to recognize it. She was expected to iron the dress. She ironed the dress. She ironed Caroline's dress too, and pressed one of Vivian's blouses, and hung them all in the appropriate wardrobes, and then she went back to the kitchen, and started on the potatoes for supper, and the afternoon slid toward evening without incident. George came home at 6:30 and asked how her day had been, and she said fine, and he said good, and they did not continue past that because they never did, not from lack of affection but from the loss of practice, the years of parallel movement through the same house without ever quite occupying the same space. She loved her father. She was almost certain he loved her, but they had lost the particular conversational ease that had existed between them before Clara died, and neither of them had found the way back to it, and the gap had widened so gradually that neither of them had seen it go. Supper was quiet. Vivian asked Caroline about her day, and Caroline described it at length. Grace added things. George listened. Amara passed the potatoes and topped up glasses when they were empty and was not asked a single question. She ate her meal and cleared the table and washed the dishes and dried them and put them away. This was the shape of the evening, as it was most evenings, and she moved through the shape of it with the efficiency of someone who has performed the same sequence enough times that it no longer requires thought, only the body moving through the familiar steps while the mind goes somewhere else. Then she went upstairs and sat on her bed in the room at the back of the house, with the window that looked onto the alley, and she opened her journal and wrote for an hour. She wrote about the morning, and the words she had heard over the garden gate, and the way she had kept her hands steady while hanging the laundry. She wrote about the roses on the eastern wall, and how they were opening now, the same roses every year, patient and certain in a way she envied. She wrote about the cup of tea she had sat with alone in the kitchen, the 10 minutes of stillness that had been entirely hers. She wrote, "I am more than what this house sees. I know this. I just do not always feel it." She looked at that sentence for a moment after she wrote it. It was the truest thing she had written in weeks. She was not always sure she believed the things she wrote, but she believed this one, most of the time, most days, even on the mornings when the words over the garden gate found their way in through the gaps in her certainty. She was more than this house saw. She held on to that. She closed the journal and lay on her back in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, and eventually, she slept. She did not know that in 4 days, at a garden party 2 streets away, everything in her life was going to begin to change. She did not know that someone was about to hear something and turn around. The 4 days between that morning and the garden party were 4 ordinary days, and Amara moved through them with the quiet efficiency that had become her default way of existing in that house. She cooked and cleaned and ironed and carried and fetched. She answered when she was spoken to and did not speak otherwise. She tended the roses along the eastern wall because nobody else did, pressing her fingers into the soil around the roots and pulling the weeds that tried to creep in. She sat with her journal at night and wrote down what she observed, what she felt, what she could not say out loud. She told herself she was not thinking about the garden party. She was, of course, thinking about it constantly, but not in the way that might be assumed. She was not thinking about it with longing. She was not imagining herself in a new dress at a table full of people who admired her. That kind of imagining had been worn smooth years ago, like a path too often walked that eventually just becomes ground. What she was thinking about was simpler and less comfortable than longing. She was thinking about what it meant that she had not been included, not even as an afterthought, not even in the way that a family sometimes includes a member out of obligation rather than desire. She had not been included because it had not occurred to anyone in that house to include her. That was the thing. Not spite, not deliberate cruelty, or at least, not entirely. It was the deeper and in some ways more damaging thing of simply not being thought about. She was present in the house the way a piece of furniture is present, necessary, in a functional sense, unremarkable, taken for granted, not the sort of thing you invited to events. On the 3rd day, Grace came downstairs in the blue dress and turned in a slow circle in the kitchen, asking Amara how it looked. Amara said it looked very nice, which it did. The dress was a good dress, and Grace was a pretty young woman. Grace said thank you in the offhand way she said most things to Amara, and then she said, almost as though the thought had just arrived, that it was too bad Amara wasn't going to the party. She said it the way you might say it was too bad about the weather, with no real feeling behind it, just a passing observation. Amara said it was all right. Grace said she supposed so, and went back upstairs. Amara stood at the kitchen sink for a moment after Grace left. She looked at her hands under the running water. Then she turned off the tap, dried her hands, and continued with what she had been doing. The morning of the party, the house became a different kind of place. There was an energy to it that Amara recognized, the particular excitement of people who are going somewhere, the small, frantic urgency of preparation, the good-natured complaints about hair and shoes and whether the blue bag or the cream bag was the right choice. Vivian moved through the upstairs rooms with a focused air of importance. Caroline helped Grace with her hair. George, who had been invited and had dressed himself in his good jacket, sat in the front room, reading the paper with the concentrated look of a man waiting for the noise to stop so they could leave. Amara made breakfast for everyone, and then she stood at the window and watched them leave through the front door. Vivian first, then Caroline, then Grace with her blue dress and her good shoes, then George with his jacket straightened by Vivian at the gate, and then the gate clicked shut, and the street was empty, and the house was quiet. She stood at the window for a moment. Then she went and made herself a cup of tea. She had a full day ahead of her, and she had already decided to make the best of it. She planned to do the things she never had time for when the house was full of people. She was going to sit in the good chair in the front room, the one by the window that nobody ever told her she could not sit in but that she somehow never sat in when others were home. And she was going to read for several hours without interruption. She had a book from the library, a novel she had been making slow progress through in the evenings, reading 10 pages at a time before she grew too tired. Today she was going to read as many pages as she liked. She did read, for about 2 hours, in the good chair, with her tea going cold beside her and the morning sun coming through the glass, and the street sounds drifting in from outside. It was, by any measure of small pleasures, a good 2 hours. She was aware the whole time of the unusual quality of the silence, the absence of voices, of footsteps overhead, of requests. She read without looking up. Just after noon, the light changed and she closed the book and went to the kitchen for water. She was thinking about what to eat for lunch when she heard a voice from outside, a man's voice, low and unhurried, speaking to someone near the lane that ran along the side of the property. The sound was ordinary enough, she was not thinking about it. She made herself a sandwich and sat at the kitchen table and ate it. Then she thought about the roses. The roses were in particular need of attention. Not the weeding, which she had done recently, but the deadheading, the removal of the spent blooms to encourage new growth. It was something she did when she had time, which was rarely enough that the roses had been building up a backlog of dead flowers for the past 2 weeks. She went out. The garden was warm in the midday sun, pleasantly warm in the way that early summer manages before the real heat arrives. The roses along the eastern wall were vivid and crowded, the new blooms competing for space with the fading ones, and she began at the near end with the small shears her mother had kept hanging in the garden shed, working her way slowly along the row. She was not thinking about the party. She was thinking about the roses, about the way the spent blooms clung stubbornly to the stem and needed a clean cut rather than a pull, about the particular quality of the light on the wall, about whether the rose at the far end, the one that had always been the most reluctant, was finally going to give a proper showing this year. She did not hear the gate until it opened. She turned at the sound, half expecting Grace to have come back for something forgotten, and saw instead a young man she did not recognize. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with the kind of face that was pleasant rather than striking, honest and at ease with itself, and he was wearing a light-colored shirt with the collar open in the way of someone who had started the morning more formally and relaxed into the afternoon. He stopped when he saw her, with the polite surprise of someone who had not expected to find anyone in the garden. "I'm sorry," he said. "I knocked at the front door. Nobody answered. I was told I might find the family through the back." She lowered the shears. "Most of the family is at the Finley party," she said. "Is there something I can help you with?" He looked at her with the particular look of someone who was actually paying attention, which was still unusual enough in her experience to be noticeable. "I'm looking for a George Bellamy," he said. "I was given this address. We have a meeting arranged for this week and I wanted to confirm the timing." "That's my father," she said. "He'll be home by 5, most likely. Shall I give him a message?" The young man considered this. "If you don't mind," he said. "I'm Nathan Cole. He knows who I am." She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a brief pause of the kind that happens sometimes between two people who are both more aware of the other than the situation strictly requires. "I'm Amara," she said. "I'll tell him." He nodded. Then, instead of turning to leave as might have been expected, he glanced at the roses along the wall and said, "Those are in remarkable condition." She followed his look. "My mother planted them," she said. "I keep them going." "What kind are they?" he asked. The question surprised her, not because it was unexpected but because it was genuine. People did not often ask about the roses. "The red ones are a heritage variety," she said. "The others are a mix. I don't know all the names." My mother kept a notebook about them, but I've lost track of which note matches which plant. A notebook, he repeated. That's a serious garden. She was serious about it, Amara said. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. Something that might have been recognition or sympathy. I won't keep you from them, he said. I'll come back at 5 to speak with your father. She said that would be fine. He left through the gate, and she stood for a moment looking at the closed gate, and then she turned back to the roses. She kept deadheading for another 20 minutes, and she told herself she was not thinking about the young man with the honest face who had asked about the roses and listened to her answer. She finished with the roses and went inside. She read for another hour and a half. Then she started a pot of soup for the evening, because when the family came back from the party they would be hungry and somewhat loud and would need feeding. She was stirring the soup when she heard the front gate open, and a moment later the front door, and then Vivian's voice filling the hallway. They were back earlier than she had expected. The party had apparently gone well. Caroline had spoken to someone interesting. Grace had been complimented on the blue dress. Vivian had had a satisfying conversation with Mrs. Finlay herself. George appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in his jacket. Something smells good, he said. Soup, Amara said. About an hour away. He nodded. He was about to leave the doorway when she said, A man came by this afternoon. Nathan Cole. He said you have a meeting arranged this week and he wanted to confirm the timing. He said he'd come back at 5. George's face registered recognition and something else. A small, private guilt she had seen before. Ah, he said. Yes. Thank you for letting me know. He went back into the hallway. Amara listened to the sounds of the house resuming its usual pattern. At a few minutes past 5, the doorbell rang. She heard her father answer it. The front room door closed. The soup pot steamed. Grace came in and asked what was for dinner, and Amara told her. An hour later, she heard the front room door open and her father showing Nathan Cole to the front door. She did not look up from the table she was setting. She heard Nathan Cole's voice in the hallway, and she heard her father's reply, and then she heard the front door close. Then her father appeared in the dining room doorway and said, in a tone she could not quite identify, Nathan Cole asks whether you would be willing to show him the roses in the garden sometime. He says he is interested in heritage roses. She held a fork in her hand. She set it on the table, carefully, in the correct position. If you like, she said. It's up to him. Her father nodded and said nothing more, and went to wash his hands for dinner. Amara finished setting the table and went back to the kitchen. She stood at the window for a moment and looked at the garden, which was now in the early evening shade, the roses darkened and still. She was not going to make anything of this. She was not going to let herself want something that had not been offered yet, because wanting was a door that, once opened, was very hard to close again, and she had spent years becoming careful about which doors she allowed herself to open. But her hands, when she went back to the soup, were very slightly less steady than usual. She did not mention that to anyone. 3 days passed before Nathan Cole came back. During those 3 days, Amara made herself very deliberate about not thinking about him. She was so deliberate about it that she thought about him constantly, which she recognized as exactly the kind of failing she had promised herself to avoid. She thought about the way he had asked about the roses, not casually, not as the polite noise people make when they are looking for something to say, but with genuine curiosity, leaning slightly toward the wall as though he actually wanted to see what he was asking about. She thought about the way he had listened when she answered. She thought about the look on his face when she had mentioned her mother's notebook, that brief shift of expression she had not been able to name precisely. She did not like this very much. She was not, by habit or inclination, a person who gave much weight to brief encounters. Her experience of brief encounters was that they were exactly that, brief, self-contained, without consequence. The world was full of people who asked pleasant questions and listened to your answers and moved on, and the lesson she had taught herself was not to mistake attention for anything more than attention. But she was thinking about him. On the second day, Vivian noticed something. Amara was not sure what she noticed exactly. She had not said anything, had not changed her behavior in any observable way. But Vivian had a particular sensitivity to anything that suggested Amara might be the subject of someone else's interest, and that sensitivity had apparently been triggered by whatever George had told her about Nathan Cole's request. Vivian came into the kitchen mid-morning while Amara was folding tea towels, and she stood at the counter with a cup of coffee and a casual expression that was not, in fact, casual at all. Your father tells me Nathan Cole asked about the garden, Vivian said. About the roses, Amara said. He mentioned he was interested in heritage varieties. Vivian considered this. She was a handsome woman, still striking in her late 40s, with an elegance that she maintained through considerable effort, and that she wore with the air of someone who wanted the effort to be invisible. Nathan Cole is a serious person, she said. His family has connections in the county. His father was well thought of. He's not the kind of person who has casual garden interests. Amara folded another tea towel and set it on the pile. He seemed quite genuine about the roses, she said. I'm sure he did, Vivian said, and the tone she used was the one Amara knew best from her, pleasant on the surface, carrying a current underneath. It was the tone that said, "This is not for you, and you should know it is not for you, and I am saying this kindly, as a favor." He's the kind of man who is polite to everyone. It's a quality. It doesn't mean what it might look like it means. Amara said nothing. She folded the last tea towel. I only mention it, Vivian said, because I don't want you to get ideas that will only make you unhappy later. You know how you get. Amara did not, in fact, know how she got, because Vivian had never been specific about it, only circular, and this was something she had stopped trying to untangle. I don't have any ideas, she said. He asked about the roses. I'll show him the roses if he comes back. That's all it is. Vivian nodded, satisfied, as though Amara had confirmed something she already knew. Good, she said. That's the sensible way to look at it. She left the kitchen, and Amara stood with the pile of folded tea towels in her hands and looked at the wall for a moment before putting them away. She felt the familiar low heat of suppressed frustration and breathed through it the way she breathed through most things she could not address directly. The third day arrived and Nathan Cole appeared at the front door at 10 in the morning, when Vivian was still upstairs and Caroline and Grace had gone out and the house was briefly quiet. George answered the door, spoke to him for a moment, and then called out to Amara from the hallway. She had been in the garden already, doing nothing in particular except standing near the roses and enjoying the morning before the house required her again. She came through the back door into the kitchen, wiping her hands on the cloth she kept in the apron pocket, and found Nathan Cole standing in the hallway with George, who had the pleased but slightly distracted look of a man who is happy to hand a situation off to someone else. Nathan wants to see the roses, George said. I have to make a phone call. If you don't mind, Amara. Of course, she said. George disappeared into the front room, and Amara and Nathan Cole stood in the hallway for a moment, in the way of two people who are suddenly alone together, without the buffer of a third party, and are each, in their own way, aware of it. Thank you for agreeing to this, Nathan said. I hope it isn't an imposition. It isn't, she said. Come through. She led him through the kitchen and out into the garden, and the morning came at them. Warm, light-filled, the roses along the wall dense, and very much in their best moment of the season, the red ones especially, open now to their full size, catching the eastern light. Nathan stopped at the edge of the lawn and looked at them, and she watched his face, and what she saw there was neither the polite performance of interest, nor the blank gaze of someone who was looking at one thing but thinking about something else. He was actually looking at the roses. His expression was that of someone seeing something they had been told to expect but that still manages to exceed the expectation. You kept them exactly right, he said, almost to himself. She came to stand beside him, not close, at the comfortable distance of two people examining the same thing. My mother was very precise about how she wanted them cared for, she said. I followed what she wrote down. What kind are the dark red ones? She told him the name. He nodded, and she could see he recognized it. He said something about the variety, something knowledgeable and unpretentious, and she found herself responding with details she had kept filed away in the back of her mind for years, the things she had read in her mother's notebook and in the library books she had borrowed. They talked about the roses for a long time. It was not a short conversation dressed up as a long one. It went where it went, from the roses to the soil conditions in the garden, to the nature of heritage plants generally, to the question of why certain things that require the most care tend to produce the most remarkable results. By the time they had moved to the far end of the wall and circled back, nearly 40 minutes had passed and the angle of the light had shifted. Amara became aware, at some point, that she had stopped managing herself. She had stopped running the faint internal check she ran almost constantly in the presence of other people, the part of her mind that monitored what she was saying, and whether it was appropriate, and how she was being received. It had simply stopped, quietly, without announcement. She was just talking, and he was talking back, with the kind of attention that is not performance, that does not break away to check whether someone more interesting has appeared nearby, that stays. She was not entirely comfortable with how much she noticed this. They reached the bench at the end of the garden, a weathered wooden bench her father had put there years ago and never quite got around to replacing, and Nathan looked at it and then at her, and she said, "You can sit, if you like." And they sat, not quite side by side, the bench being wide enough for a person's worth of space between them. "How long have you been caring for them?" he asked. "The roses." "Since my mother died," she said. 8 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a long commitment to something someone else started." She thought about that. "It didn't feel like a commitment at the time," she said. "It just felt like the thing to do." She loved them. It would have been strange to let them go. He looked at her when she said this. Not the looking of someone assessing, not the measured look of someone forming a judgment, just looking at her. She felt it and did not look away, which was in itself a small act of bravery that she recognized as such even as she performed it. "Do you know what I think?" he said. She waited. "I think the right things usually get cared for by the right people," he said. "But the people doing the caring often don't get half the credit they deserve." She did not say anything for a moment. She was thinking about whether she had heard that right, whether she was reading into it the things she wanted to find, which was the risk she was always most afraid of. "That's a generous way to look at it," she said finally. "It's an accurate one," he said. The morning had moved into mid-morning while they were not paying attention, and the sound of the front door opening and Vivian's heels on the hall floor reached them a moment later. Nathan Cole stood up from the bench when he heard it, and Amara stood too, and they walked back across the lawn to the house with the easy, unhurried movement of two people who are not in a hurry and know it. Vivian appeared at the kitchen door and saw them coming across the grass, and her expression did something complicated that resolved itself into a smile that was not entirely warm. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I didn't know you'd come back. Let me put the kettle on." "Thank you, but I should be going," he said pleasantly. "Your garden is in extraordinary hands, Mrs. Bellamy." Vivian said something gracious. Nathan said goodbye to Amara, by name, looking at her, not at the kitchen door or at Vivian, and then he went through the house and out the front door. Vivian stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Amara with an expression that had shifted from complicated to something simpler and less comfortable. "He was here for almost an hour," Vivian said. "We talked about the roses," Amara said. Vivian said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "He's not the sort of man who visits for an hour just to look at roses." She went back inside. Amara stayed in the garden for a while. She stood at the roses and looked at them and thought about the fact that Vivian, for once, had said something that she agreed with. He was not the sort of man who visited for an hour just to look at roses. She was not going to think about what that meant. She was going to be careful and calm, and not build expectations on foundations that had not been laid. She was going to continue being the version of herself that she had built through great effort over many years, the version that did not get hurt because it did not get ahead of itself. Then she remembered his voice saying the right things usually get cared for by the right people, and she thought that she was probably, despite everything, going to think about it anyway. Nathan Cole came back the following week, and the week after that, and by the third visit it had become something that the household noticed and responded to in its various different ways. George responded with quiet, careful pleasure. He had always had a good impression of Nathan. There was some business connection between them that Amara had not fully pieced together, something to do with a development project on the north side of town that George had been involved in for the past year. Nathan was, by George's account, a man of unusual reliability in a field where reliability was rarer than it should have been. He was also, it was becoming clear to George, a man who was returning to this house with greater frequency than any business matter strictly required. And George, who was not unobservant, had started to notice where Nathan's attention went when he was in the kitchen, or the garden, or the hallway. He had not said anything to Amara about it. He was not a man who said things before he was certain, and he was not yet certain. But there was something new in the way he looked at her in the evenings, something searching and almost apologetic, as though he were calculating the interest on a debt he had not known he had accrued. Caroline responded with something that might have been curiosity if it had come from anyone else, but in her had a faintly predatory quality. She began appearing in rooms where Nathan was, more frequently than chance could explain, and contributing to conversations with a brightness that was effortful, in a way that her ordinary conversation was not. She asked him questions. She laughed at things he said. She was, in the technical sense, charming, and Amara watched it without alarm because she had watched Caroline be charming before, and she understood that charm was a performance, and performances had limits. Grace was less interested in strategy and more interested in novelty. She found the situation amusing in the uncomplicated way she found most situations amusing, and she said things to Amara in private that were intended as teasing but had an edge to them. Little comments about how unexpected it was, how nobody saw it coming, how interesting that it was Amara he kept asking to see. Vivian's response was the most sustained and the most complicated. In the days after the second visit, Vivian was pleasant in a way that Amara found more unsettling than her usual treatment. She asked Amara how the garden was doing. She commented that the roses were looking particularly nice this year. She mentioned Nathan Cole's family in a tone that was both admiring and instructive. His father had been a man of standing, his mother came from a respected name. He had built what he had through work rather than inheritance, which was, Vivian said, the best kind of man. Then, on the 5th day after his second visit, Vivian sat down across from Amara at the kitchen table, while Amara was shelling peas, and she said something that cut through all the pleasantness like a stone dropped into water. "I need you to understand something," Vivian said, "and I'm saying this because I actually care about your feelings, even if you don't always believe that." Amara kept shelling peas. "A man like Nathan Cole," Vivian said, "can be very kind. He can take an interest. He can spend time somewhere and be generous with his attention. That's part of what he is. It's not a fault in him, but there is a difference between a man being kind and a man being serious, and I think you need to be clear-headed about which this is." "I haven't assumed anything," Amara said. "I know you haven't," Vivian said, "but you feel things, Amara. You always have, and I don't want to see you hurt." There was just enough truth in it to make it effective. That was the skill Vivian had always had, the way she embedded her meaning in a shell of something that resembled concern, so that to reject the meaning you had to also reject the concern, and rejecting concern made you look either paranoid or ungrateful. Amara shelled 3 more peas into the bowl. "Thank you," she said. Vivian watched her for a moment, then she said, in a lower voice that she might have thought was warmer, "You're a good girl, Amara. You always have been. Some men respond to that. Not all of them mean it to go anywhere." She left the kitchen. Amara sat for a long time after she left, her hands still among the pea pods, not shelling. She was doing the thing she hated doing most, doubting herself. Not doubting what Nathan had said or done, doubting her own reading of them, asking herself whether she had misread the attention, whether she had turned something ordinary into something it was not, because she wanted it to be something more. It was possible. She knew it was possible. She was not, by her own assessment, a woman that men made special efforts for. She knew how she appeared to people. She was quiet in groups. She did not sparkle in the way that drew attention. She was not witty in the effortless way that Grace was, or polished in the way that Caroline was. These were not self-pitying assessments. They were simply what she understood to be true, based on available information. Maybe Nathan Cole was kind, as Vivian had said, and kind people spent time with whoever happened to be there, and she had been the one who was there. She picked up the peas again and finished shelling them. He came back 3 days later. This time Vivian had arranged for Caroline to be in the garden when he arrived. This had been done with the seamlessness that Vivian brought to all her organizing. There had been no announcement, no obvious maneuvering. Caroline simply appeared in the garden on a morning when Nathan was expected, wearing a dress that suited her well, with a book she was not actually reading open on the garden table. Amara saw this from the kitchen window. She felt something complicated and controlled it. Nathan arrived, and George brought him through to the garden, and Caroline looked up from her book with a smile she had clearly been holding ready. She said his name with a warmth that was not affected. She had the advantage, Amara thought, of being genuinely easy to be around when she chose to be. Nathan sat in the garden chair positioned near the table, and they talked, and Amara watched from the kitchen window while she dried plates. Then Nathan looked toward the house. He looked at the kitchen window. He did not look away quickly, the way you might if you had been caught looking. He looked deliberately, as though looking for something specific. He found her. He said something to Caroline, and Caroline's expression shifted in a way Amara could not read from the window, and then Nathan stood up and walked toward the kitchen door. He knocked on the open door. "I was hoping you might walk with me to the roses," he said to Amara, standing at the door. "If you're free." She dried her hands on the cloth. "Give me a moment," she said. She put down the cloth and went out through the kitchen door and into the garden, and they walked together across the lawn toward the eastern wall, while Caroline sat at the garden table with her not-reading book, and Amara felt the weight of being watched from that direction, but kept her eyes on the roses. "Your stepmother invited her daughter specifically for this morning, didn't she?" Nathan said when they reached the wall. It was stated rather than asked, and stated so directly that she turned to look at him. "I think so," she said. He nodded, without judgment in either direction. "I thought so," he said. "I want to be honest with you about something, if that's all right." She waited. "I came back," he said. "Not because of the roses. I came back because of the person who keeps the roses. I want to be clear about that in case there was any doubt." She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at him. The roses were very close, their scent warmed by the morning. "There was some doubt," she said. "I know," he said. He said it simply, without apology and without vanity. I imagine there's been a fair amount of doubt introduced over the past few weeks. She thought of Vivian at the kitchen table, of the careful construction of her words. She thought of Caroline on the garden bench with the unread book. She said. Nathan looked at the roses for a moment. Then he said, I grew up in a house where my mother was the one who did the things that kept it going, and was the last person to be thanked for any of them. I know what it looks like. I know the difference between the person who is the center of a household and the person who is credited with being it. She felt something in her chest that she had been holding for a very long time shift, just slightly, like a stone that has been in one place for so long it has settled into the ground around it, and then something moves and suddenly it is a stone that can be moved. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in a garden in front of a man she had known for less than a month, but the feeling was there, real and large, and she breathed through it. Thank you for saying that, she said. He looked at her. I mean it, he said. They stood at the roses for a while, talking about less important things, and the morning went on around them, and from across the lawn Caroline watched from behind her book, and inside the kitchen, Vivian watched from behind a different kind of distance. And neither of them could do anything about what was quietly and clearly happening at the far wall of the garden, where a young woman who had spent years being told she was not worth looking at was being looked at, fully and deliberately, by someone who had decided she was exactly worth it. The campaign began the following Monday. Amara would call it a campaign only much later, looking back with the clarity that comes when enough time has passed for the shape of things to be visible. At the time, she experienced it as a series of incidents that felt separate but were not, that arrived close together and from different directions but were, she eventually understood, coordinated in the way that certain kinds of damage are coordinated, not by formal agreement but by shared interest, by the instinctive solidarity of people who want the same outcome and have the same tools. Vivian started with the neighborhood. She did not do it noisily. She was not the kind of woman who made her moves noisily. She did it in the way she did most things, through conversation, through implication, through the selective release of information in settings where it would travel. The first hint Amara had was from a woman named Mrs. Audrey Grant, a small, quick woman in her 60s who lived at the end of the road and had always been civil to Amara in the way of someone who considers civility a base standard and applies it to everyone equally. Amara met her at the post office on Tuesday morning, and Mrs. Grant said good morning and asked how the family was, and then said, in a careful tone, I heard you've had Nathan Cole visiting. The Cole family are good people. He has business with my father, Amara said, and he's interested in the garden. Mrs. Grant gave her a look that contained more information than her words. Yes, she said. That's what I heard. A very polite young man. They say he's been very attentive. She paused. Very attentive to the whole family. It took Amara a moment to parse that. When she did, she felt the specific cold clarity of understanding. Vivian had been describing Nathan's visits as interest in the household generally. She had been, very likely, steering the neighborhood's interpretation towards something that made Amara peripheral, a background presence in a story whose main characters were the two daughters, the kind of pretty, sociable young women whom a man of Nathan's standing might reasonably be expected to be paying attention to. She went home and said nothing. On Wednesday, Vivian arranged a dinner. She did not consult Amara about the dinner. She told her that Nathan Cole was coming for dinner on Friday evening, that she had spoken to George who had agreed, and that she needed Amara to prepare the meal and serve it. The meal was to be a good one, 3 courses, properly done, with the good china that lived in the cabinet in the dining room and was brought out for visitors of significance. Caroline and Grace would be at the table. George would be at the table. Vivian would be at the table. And me? Amara said. Vivian looked at her with an expression of careful surprise, as though Amara had said something unexpected but not, regrettably, surprising. There won't be room for 7 people at the table, she said. I thought you'd understand. You can eat in the kitchen. Amara held the kitchen cloth in her hands. Of course, she said. She cooked the dinner. She took the preparation seriously, not out of any desire to please the situation she had been placed in, but because she was the kind of person who did not know how to do things carelessly. She made a soup first, then a chicken dish with the herbs from the garden, then a pudding that took most of Friday afternoon. She pressed the good cloth napkins. She laid the table in the dining room and put the good china out and made everything exactly right. Then she made herself a plate and sat in the kitchen and ate while the sounds of the dinner party reached her from one room away. She heard Vivian's voice, warm and carrying, performing the role of gracious hostess with the fluency of long practice. She heard Caroline's laugh, which was a pretty sound deployed thoughtfully. She heard Grace saying something that produced general amusement. She heard her father's lower voice, comfortable in the company of a man he respected. She heard Nathan Cole's voice, and she noticed it with more attention than she wanted to admit. He was easy in conversation. She had observed this about him from the start. He did not perform ease. It was simply his natural register, the unhurried confidence of someone who knows who he is and does not need the reassurance of other people's attention to confirm it. She finished her meal and cleared her plate and stood at the kitchen sink, and she told herself that this was a useful reminder. Vivian had arranged this dinner for a reason. The reason was to show Nathan Cole what this household contained, and to make it clear what role Amara occupied within it. And if she was being honest, it was probably working. She washed up her plate and her glass and dried them and put them away. Then she sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a book she had borrowed from the library, and she read, because she was not going to spend the evening listening at the kitchen wall like someone waiting to be called. The dinner was a long one. She heard the scrape of chairs eventually, the sounds of movement, the conversation moving to the hallway and then to the front room, and she stayed in the kitchen until she heard the front door open and close and the sounds of the evening settle back into their ordinary quietness. George came into the kitchen. He was loosening his collar, the small private sign that he was done performing sociability for the evening. He looked at her at the kitchen table with her book, and something passed across his face. "Good dinner," he said. "Thank you," she said. He stood there for a moment. He was going to say something. Then he changed his mind and simply said goodnight and went upstairs. And she stayed in the kitchen a while longer. She was being honest with herself, which she was good at, because the journal had trained her in it. What was actually happening was this. A man had shown genuine interest in her, and a woman had responded to that by arranging the situation so that the interest would be redirected. She turned a page of her book without reading it. Then she heard a knock at the kitchen door. She went to the door and opened it. Nathan Cole stood outside with his jacket over his arm in the light from the kitchen window. "I thought you might be here," he said. "I wanted to ask if I could come in for a moment." She stepped back to let him in. He came into the kitchen with the ease of someone who moves through spaces without making them feel crowded, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and it was the most direct they had been with each other yet. Just two people in a lit kitchen, with no audience and nothing to perform. "You cooked all of that," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He looked at the kitchen, at the cleared surfaces, the dried pots, the evidence of hours of work that had produced a dinner he had just eaten at a table where she had not been sitting. "Why didn't you say anything?" he said. "What would I have said?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I looked for you." She took that in. "I kept wondering where you were," he said. "Your stepmother said you'd eaten earlier. I didn't understand it at first, and then I did. And I should have said something at the table, and I didn't, and I'm sorry for that." "It's all right," she said. "It isn't, really," he said simply, without drama. "But I wanted you to know that I was aware of it, and I want to be clear about something." He paused, choosing his words with what she could tell was care. "I came to this house originally for business, but I keep coming back because of you. I'd like the chance to get to know you better, if you're willing. Not in gardens or kitchens with audiences watching from windows. I'd like to take you somewhere and have a proper conversation." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I would like that." He nodded, and there was something in his expression that was neither triumph nor relief, but something quieter than both. He said he would call on her the following week and they would decide on the details. He said goodnight. He went back out through the kitchen door into the lane. She closed the door behind him and stood at it for a moment, her hand on the handle. Then she went to the table and sat down with her book and she read, genuinely read this time, the words actually landing in the sequence they were meant to land in, and the kitchen was warm and quiet around her, and it was the beginning of something, even though nothing about the evening looked like it. She told no one. This was not deception exactly. It was the instinct of someone who has learned that the things she values most are safest when kept private, when not offered up for other people's assessment before they are solid enough to withstand it. She had kept herself in this way for years, and she applied the same instinct now, simply and quietly, because it was what she knew how to do. Nathan had said he would call the following week, and the following week he did, on a Thursday morning when the house was quiet. He knocked at the front door and she answered it, and he said good morning and asked whether she would walk with him to the park at the end of the road. She said she would, and she put on her coat and told no one, because there was no one in the house to tell. She simply left. The park was 15 minutes walk away, a respectable green space with a pond in the center and a line of old trees along the western edge that shaded a row of benches. They walked there and then walked along the path that circled the pond, and they talked, and it was the first time she had been somewhere with him that was not the garden of her own house, not in view of kitchen windows, not in a room full of the complicated politics of her family. She felt the difference in her body before she consciously registered it. It was easier to breathe. That was the clearest thing. She was not unconsciously calculating anyone's reaction, or managing anyone's feelings, or performing the careful nothing she performed at home. She was just walking and talking with someone, and it had been long enough since she had done that without added difficulty that she had forgotten how much space it took up in her, the management of everything, and what it felt like when that management was not required. Nathan noticed. She could see that he noticed without remarking on it, which was one of the things she was beginning to understand about him. He was observant in the way that some people are, with a quiet, accumulated attention that processed what it saw and held it without immediately making it the subject of conversation. They talked about many things. She told him about the reading course at the library, which she had signed up for the previous autumn, and had been making slow progress through. It was an introduction to literature course, 8 weeks, and she had come to it with a mixture of eagerness and self-consciousness that she had eventually managed into something more comfortable. He asked what she had read. She told him. He knew the books, and they had opinions about each of them, and the opinions were not always the same, and the conversation they had about that was one of the best conversations she could remember having. She told him about the journal, briefly, without going into detail. She mentioned that she had kept one since she was 15, and that it had been a form of company in the years when company was not otherwise readily available. He listened to this the way he listened to most things she said, with full attention, and without the faintly performative sympathy she had learned to distrust. He said, "What do you write about?" She said, "Everything. What I see, what I feel, what I think, things I can't say in the room." He said, "That sounds necessary." She said, "It was." They sat on one of the benches under the old trees and watched the water for a while, and the comfortable silence that had been developing between them settled in without awkwardness. She had not had many comfortable silences with people. The silences in her experience were usually either the silences of being excluded, or the silences of deliberate tension. A silence that was simply two people being at ease in the same space was something she had missed without fully knowing she was missing it. He asked her about her mother. He did not do it suddenly or obtrusively. He came to it through a conversation about the roses, about the notebook Clara had kept, about what it meant to learn things from someone who was no longer there to correct the mistakes. She found herself talking about Clara in ways she rarely did, not the brief, contained mentions she offered when the subject came up unavoidably, but actual memory, actual detail, the kind of talking about someone that brings them into the air of the present moment. She told him about Clara's habit of singing very quietly while she worked in the garden, nothing tuneful, just a low, continuous sound, like something between humming and speaking. She told him about the Sunday afternoon ritual of the library, the two of them walking there together in all weathers, coming back with more books than they needed. She told him about the last photograph she had of her mother, taken in the garden against the rose wall, 2 weeks before she got ill, how she was looking away from the camera because something had moved in the hedge. Nathan listened to all of it. He did not say, "I'm sorry," in the careful, slightly distancing way that people say it when they are performing condolence. He did not move on quickly to something else. He let it be what it was, and then he said, "She sounds like someone worth grieving," and it was the most accurate and the most generous thing anyone had ever said to her about her mother, and she felt the truth of it settle through her like water finding its level. She was, Amara said. The afternoon went on. They walked the full circuit of the park. They stopped at the bakery near the park entrance and he bought 2 cups of tea and they drank them standing up, which was not elegant, but was very easy, and she found herself laughing at something he said, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that happens when you are not watching yourself. She saw him notice that too. She did not look away. On the walk back, the conversation found its way to the situation at home, not through any obvious turn but in the natural way that conversations find the things that need to be found. He said, at some point, "Is it difficult? Living there?" And she considered the question properly, which meant giving it the honest answer rather than the managing one. "It has been," she said, "for a long time. I've become good at it, which I'm not sure is the same thing as it getting easier. You can become good at things that are still hard." He was quiet for a moment, then, "And now?" "Now," she said, "it's a little harder to be patient with it, which might mean something is changing." He looked at her steadily as they walked. "Things are changing," he said. She held that thought carefully, the way you hold something fragile when you are not yet sure of your grip. She held it all the way home, and she was still holding it when she came in through the front door, and hung up her coat, and went to the kitchen to start the evening preparations. Vivian was at the kitchen table. She had clearly been there for some time, with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen. "Where have you been?" Vivian said. "I went for a walk," Amara said. She went to the sink and washed her hands. "By yourself?" Vivian said. Amara dried her hands on the cloth. She turned and looked at her stepmother, and she did something she had not done before in 6 years of these conversations. She looked at her directly, without the managed neutral expression, without the careful face that said nothing and gave nothing away. "No," she said. A silence. Vivian's expression changed in a way Amara had not seen before, something behind the eyes, behind the controlled surface. Then she said, "I see." And there was nothing more said that evening. But the thing that had been said was enough, and they both knew it, and the kitchen held the knowledge of it like a room holds the shape of something that has happened in it, long after the thing is over. Amara made dinner and the evening was quiet, and she sat at the table that night, because nobody suggested otherwise, and she ate her dinner with the rest of the family, and said little and thought much, and afterward she went upstairs and wrote in her journal for a long time. She wrote, "Something is changing. I am going to let myself know that it is real, even if I am also afraid of it." Vivian moved quickly after that. Amara had expected something, because she understood her stepmother well enough to know that a woman like Vivian did not absorb information passively. She processed it and responded to it, and the response was always strategic even when it appeared casual. What she had not anticipated was how many directions the response would come from at once. The first direction was the most direct. Vivian went to see Nathan Cole. Amara found out about it afterward, not from Vivian, who said nothing, and not from Nathan, who told her quietly and without drama on his next visit. Vivian had called at the Cole house on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the evening when Amara had confirmed where she had been. She had gone there without telling George and had spent, by Nathan's account, about 40 minutes in the sitting room with his Aunt Margaret, who lived in the house and managed most of its social arrangements. Nathan had been present for part of it. He told Amara what he had heard. Vivian had presented herself as a concerned parent figure, not dramatically, not with any specific accusation, but in the careful language of implied concern. She had spoken about Amara as a young woman who had always been vulnerable, who had a difficult time distinguishing friendly attention from something more serious, who had been through a hard childhood and had never quite developed the defenses that healthier circumstances might have given her. She had said this with evident sympathy, with a face full of gentle worry, with the manner of a woman who hated to say anything at all but felt she had a responsibility to speak. She had said, essentially, that any attention Nathan paid to Amara would be amplified by Amara into something it was not, and that this could end badly for a girl of her temperament, and that perhaps it was kinder to everyone if Nathan's visits to the house were kept to the business matters with George. Nathan told Amara this on a Wednesday afternoon, in the garden, in a voice that was measured and completely clear. She sat very still while he spoke. She felt each part of it as it arrived, the way you feel cold water, the full temperature before the initial shock diminishes. She was not surprised. She had known, at some level, that something like this was possible, that Vivian's tools were social, and that using them meant going to the places where the social decisions were made. "She told your aunt I was unstable," she said. "She was more careful than that," Nathan said. "But yes, that was the meaning." Amara looked at the roses for a moment. "And your aunt?" "My aunt is a woman of considerable experience," Nathan said. "She heard everything Mrs. Bellamy said. She was very gracious to her. After she left, she found me, and said that she had met a woman who was very worried about someone she clearly had no use for, and that she would trust my judgment in the matter." She turned to look at him. "Your aunt sounds remarkable," she said. "She really is," he said. She stood up from the bench. There was something moving in her that was anger, real anger, not the managed version she was used to carrying, but the hot, clear kind that had been building pressure for a long time, and was now very close to the surface. She walked to the roses and stood with her back to him for a moment, her hands hanging at her sides. "She went to your aunt," she said. "She did it because I'm supposed to be nothing that anyone would seriously want, and if that's supposed to be obvious, then the fact that you keep coming back is an error she needs to correct." "Yes," Nathan said. "She's been doing versions of this for 6 years," Amara said, "and I've been quiet about it. I've been very quiet. I thought that was the most sensible thing. I thought that being quiet and being patient was the dignified response. And now I'm wondering whether I was wrong about that, whether quiet was just the thing that made it easier for her." Nathan came and stood beside her, not touching her, just present. "I need you to hear something," he said. She turned. "What she did," he said, "did not work. I want to be clear about that. It did not change anything about what I think or what I want. The only thing it changed is that I now think you deserve to know exactly what you've been dealing with. Clearly, from someone who has seen it from outside. She looked at him. Her eyes were burning, but she was not going to cry. You're not difficult, he said. You're not unstable. You're not someone whose feelings should be managed by other people making decisions on your behalf. You are a clear-eyed, capable person who has been living in a house where being clear-eyed and capable has been treated as something to suppress. And I think you know all of this. I think you've known it for a long time. I just wanted someone to say it to you out loud. The anger in her was still there, but it was different now. More complex, less like pressure looking for release, and more like something being finally acknowledged after a long silence. Thank you, she said. He said, I'm going to speak to your father. She looked at him. About us, he said. About the possibility of an us, if that's what you want. I'm not going to make the approach through your stepmother, or around her, or in response to her. I'm going to speak to your father directly and properly, and I'd like to do it with your knowledge and your permission. She stood in the garden and felt several large things moving in her at once. Yes, she said, you have my permission. The second direction of Vivian's response arrived the following day, in the form of Grace. Grace came to her room that evening, which in itself was notable enough to be alarming. Grace did not come to Amara's room, but Grace knocked, and when Amara opened the door she came in, and sat on the end of the bed in the way of someone who has been sent on a mission, and is mildly uncomfortable about it but will carry it out. Mother wants me to talk to you, Grace said. She said it plainly, which Amara had always appreciated about Grace. All right, Amara said. She's worried about you, Grace said. About Nathan Cole. She says you're making more of it than it is, and that you're going to get hurt when nothing comes of it. Is she wrong? Grace said. And this was the thing about Grace that made her different from her mother and her sister. She was occasionally simply curious. She was asking a genuine question. Yes, Amara said. Grace sat with that for a moment. He's coming to see Father. Yes. A pause. Grace looked at her hands. Mother is going to be furious, she said. She already is, Amara said. Grace looked at her with something that was not quite guilt and not quite respect but was somewhere between them. I think I stopped thinking about it at all a long time ago, Grace said quietly, which is probably its own kind of answer. They sat with that for a moment. Grace, Amara said, it's all right. Grace looked at her, and for a moment, she looked young in a way she usually did not. Then she nodded, and stood up and said good night, and left. Amara closed the door behind her and sat back down at her desk. She opened the journal. She wrote, I am not afraid. I am terrified and I am ready, and both of those are true at the same time, and I am going to let what happens happen. She underlined the last part. Then she closed the journal and went to bed, and slept better than she had slept in months. Nathan came to speak to George on a Saturday morning, and Amara knew he was coming, and had said nothing to anyone. She was in the kitchen when he arrived, and she heard her father answer the front door, and the sound of the two men's voices in the hallway, and then the front room door closing behind them. She had arranged to be in the kitchen because it was the room farthest from the front room, and she had enough awareness of herself to know that being anywhere closer would make the next half hour unmanageable. She made bread. She had not planned to make bread. It was not a task that needed doing, but it required physical effort and focus, both of which were things she needed very much in that moment. And so she got out the flour and the yeast and the salt and worked the dough with her hands on the kitchen table, while the morning light came through the window and the house held its breath around her. She had been mixing and folding for 20 minutes when she heard Vivian on the stairs. Vivian came into the kitchen in a way that seemed casual and was not. She moved to the kettle with the practiced naturalness of someone performing a routine, though her eyes went immediately and with obvious purpose to the closed front room door, which she could see from the kitchen. Nathan Cole is here, she said. Yes, Amara said. A pause. He's with your father. Yes, Amara said. She worked the dough. Vivian stood at the kettle and did not turn it on. She was thinking, which was visible even from behind. She was doing the calculation, and Amara, who had lived in the same house as this calculation for years, could read the shape of it. Did you know he was coming? Vivian said. Amara did not answer immediately. She finished the fold she was in the middle of, because to stop mid-fold was to lose the texture, and then she said, yes. Another pause. Vivian turned. She looked at Amara at the kitchen table with the dough in her hands, and her expression was a complicated one. The expression of a woman who has used many tools over many years, and is confronting, For the first time, the possibility that they will not work. There was anger in it, yes, but there was something else too. The thing that happens to a person's face when the story they have been telling themselves about the world turns out to have a fact in it that they missed. Amara, she said. Amara looked up. I want you to think carefully, Vivian said. I want you to think about what you are doing and what you imagine is going to happen, and whether you have genuinely thought this through. You are putting something in motion that you may not be able to stop, and when it goes wrong, not if, when, you will be the one who has to live with it. Not him, not me, you. It was the most direct she had ever been. Amara looked at her for a long moment. 6 years of these conversations had collected in her somewhere, all of them. The ones at the kitchen table, and the ones over garden gates, and the ones delivered with smiles to visiting neighbors, and the one that Nathan had heard at the coal house. They were all present in her in this moment, and she felt their weight clearly, not as pain exactly, not anymore, but as information, as the full picture of what had been happening, and why, and for how long. Vivian, she said, I have thought this through. She went back to the dough. Vivian stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, then she left. The front room door opened, 25 minutes after Nathan had arrived. Amara heard her father's voice, then Nathan's, and the sound of them moving to the hallway, and then a knock at the kitchen door. Her father came in. She looked at him. He looked at her, and his face had an expression she had not seen on it in a very long time. Something open in it, something slightly raw. The face of a man who has just had a conversation that required him to be honest in a way he had been avoiding. Nathan Cole would like to see you, he said. She covered the dough bowl with the cloth. How did the conversation go? She said. Her father was quiet for a moment. Then, he's a good man, he said. He's a very good man. He paused. I told him so. He stepped aside, and she went out to the hallway where Nathan was waiting, and they looked at each other in the quiet morning light of the hall, with the house around them. Well, she said. Your father has agreed to let me take you out properly, Nathan said. He was very gracious about it, and also, I think, somewhat relieved. She felt a warmth in her chest that was not exactly surprise, and not exactly certainty, but something that held elements of both. Where would you like to go? Nathan asked. She thought. There's a market on Saturday afternoons, she said. 2 streets from the park. I've been meaning to go for months. He smiled. Let's go to the market, he said. She went upstairs for her coat. On the landing she passed Vivian's bedroom, the door of which was slightly open, and she did not look in, but she was aware of the presence behind the door, and she thought about saying something, some final word, some acknowledgement of what had just shifted, and then she thought better of it, because there was nothing she needed to say. The situation had said it, the morning had said it. There was no word she could add that would improve on what had simply, finally happened. She went downstairs. She walked out of the house through the front door with Nathan Cole, and the Saturday morning was bright and warm and the street was full of ordinary weekend activity, and nobody who saw them walking down the road together would have been able to tell that this was the first time in a very long time that she had walked out of that house feeling, simply and clearly, like herself. They went to the market. It was, by any measure, a perfect afternoon. The weeks after that Saturday were the strangest of Amara's life, not because anything about them was dramatic or turbulent, but because they required her to learn something she had no previous experience in, being treated as though she mattered, and allowing herself to believe it. Nathan was consistent. That was the first and most important thing about him in those weeks. He did not appear and disappear. He did not make gestures and then pull back to see how she responded to the withdrawal, which was something she had observed in other people's relationships, and which she had always understood, privately, to be a form of testing that she would fail, because she would not chase. Nathan did not test her. He simply showed up, on the days he had said he would show up, at the times he had indicated, and he was there. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. In her experience, reliability was the rarest quality, because it cost the most. It required you to be the same person each time, to not have changed your mind since last Tuesday, to have meant what you said even now that saying it had committed you to something. Nathan was reliable in this way, straightforwardly, without apparent effort. They went to places. They went back to the park and to the market, and to a bookshop on the high street that she had been inside twice, and always left thinking she should come back. They went to the small Italian restaurant near the theater where the food was not particularly distinguished, but the room was warm, and the tables were set close enough together that the general murmur of other people's conversations provided a kind of comfortable cover. They walked. They talked. She was becoming, she discovered, A person who talked easily with someone when the someone was right. This was new information about herself. She had believed for a long time that she was a person who did not talk easily, that conversation for her was always a managed thing, a deliberate effort to construct and deliver appropriate responses while monitoring for the subtle signs that she had said something unexpected or wrong. She had thought this was simply how she was. But she talked with Nathan. She did not manage it. The conversations went where they went, found their own shape, came around to things she had not intended to say and said them anyway, and none of it felt like performance. The house, meanwhile, was different. George was more present. This was the most visible change, and it had started the morning Nathan had come to speak to him, that morning in the front room when the two men had had a conversation that had required something from George that he had not previously been able to give. He began appearing in the kitchen in the evenings. He began sitting with her for the last part of the washing up, which was a task he had never been involved in during all the years of her doing it. They talked during these evenings, in the careful, relearning way of people who have been too long out of the habit of each other. She thought about forgiving him, not abstractly but as an actual, active decision she could make. The choice to let the accumulated weight of his silence cost what it cost and then put it down and not carry it further. She thought she was making it incrementally, in small installments, in the minutes at the kitchen sink with the drying cloth in her hands. Vivian was quiet. This was the strangest part of the new atmosphere in the house. Vivian had always been something, a presence, a force operating at various levels of visibility. Her quietness now was not the quietness of someone who had found peace or acceptance. It was the quietness of someone who was recalibrating, who had encountered a situation that had not gone as she had organized it to go. Caroline maintained her careful distance, but she managed it differently now, with a kind of assessment in it, as though Amara had revealed herself to be something unexpected and Caroline was deciding how to update her evaluation. They had not become friends. They were not going to become friends, but there was something in Caroline now that had not been there before, something that resembled, at its edges, respect. Grace continued to be the most honest of the three. She said things to Amara now that she had not said before, small, unglamorous things, that she thought Nathan was actually quite wonderful, that she was glad things were working out, that she was sorry for the things she had said in the years when she had thought them amusing. The apologies were brief and slightly embarrassed and entirely genuine, and Amara accepted them in the spirit in which they were offered. Nathan asked her, on an evening in the park 4 weeks after the Saturday when they had walked out of her house together for the first time, whether she had thought about the future. She looked at him. "What kind of future?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "The kind that involves a question," he said, "that I want to ask you properly, when the time is right, and not before it is. I want to know whether you're thinking in that direction." She looked at the pond. She looked at the old trees on the western edge. She looked at her own hands, resting in her lap. "Yes," she said. It was the simplest and the truest word she had ever spoken in that park, and it went out into the warm evening air between them and stayed there, real and bright. He nodded. He was smiling, and she was smiling, and the park was full of the ordinary beauty of a good evening in early summer. She thought about her mother. She thought about Clara, who had planted the roses and kept the notebook and sung under her breath in the garden, who had been loved well and who had died too soon, and she thought that there was something her mother would have said about this moment, something simple and true, and though she could not know exactly what it would have been, she thought she could feel the general shape of it. It would have been warm. It would have been glad. She looked up at the evening sky. She thought, I knew too. I just needed to wait for the right moment to believe it. Nathan asked her to marry him on a Tuesday morning in the garden. It was not a dramatic morning. The garden was at its late summer peak, the roses fuller and heavier than at any point she could remember in the years she had tended them, the air sweet and warm and carrying that particular quality of late summer mornings that feel both ripe and slightly elegiac, as though they know what comes after them. She had been deadheading again, the same task she had been doing on the morning he first walked through the gate, which had not escaped either of them, and he had been standing nearby at the bench, and the conversation had found its way to the future, in the way their conversations often found their way there, with a naturalness that she no longer found frightening. He said her name first, then he said the rest. He did not kneel, because he had asked her once whether that particular convention appealed to her, and she had said honestly that it did not, that it made her think about knees on damp earth, and he had laughed and she had laughed, and the agreement had been made without ever needing to be stated directly. He looked at her, and he was clear-eyed and completely unafraid, and he asked her if she would marry him. She put down the shears. Yes, she said. And then, because it was their private vocabulary, and because he would understand it, obviously yes. He did laugh then, and she laughed, And he took her hand and they stood in the garden with the roses behind them and the morning light on the wall. And it was in almost every external detail exactly the same garden she had stood in on 100 troubled mornings over the years. And yet it was entirely different. Because everything inside it was different, and she was different, and the person whose hand she was holding had made much of that difference possible. She told her father first. She had decided that before the morning. She found him in the front room with his paper, and she sat in the chair across from him and told him, and he put the paper down and looked at her with an expression that contained so many things she could not name them individually, but could feel them as a whole, the weight of years and guilt and love, and the particular sorrow of a father who knows he has given less than he should have given, and the enormous, tentative relief of seeing something good arriving in spite of that. He said, "I'm so glad." He said it very quietly, and she heard something crack at the edge of his voice. "Dad," she said. He shook his head. He was pressing his lips together. He was not going to manage this very elegantly, which was typical of him, and something she had always loved without ever articulating it. He was not an elegant man in his emotions. He felt things in the large, clumsy way of someone who did not have a tidy system for feelings, and had never managed to build one. "I'm sorry," he said. She sat with that. "I know," she said. "I know you are." They sat together for a moment in the way they had been relearning to sit together in the recent weeks. Then she reached across the small table and put her hand over his, and he looked down at it and then back at her, and she saw the full weight of what he had carried, and the small beginning of its lifting. Vivian was told next. Amara found her in the kitchen, which was, she thought, probably the most appropriate room. All the significant conversations between them had happened in this kitchen, over years, and it seemed fitting that this one should happen here too, at the end. Vivian was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, and she looked at them both when they came in with the expression of a woman who already knows what she is about to hear. Amara said it simply. Nathan and she were engaged. They were going to be married. She wanted Vivian to know before it was spoken about to anyone else, out of the basic respect of telling someone directly rather than having them find out sideways. Vivian set her coffee cup down on the counter. She looked at Amara, and then at Nathan, and then at Amara again. The expression on her face went through several things in quick succession. The initial shock of something that she had worked to prevent and had not prevented. The quick internal accounting of a strategic mind recalculating its position, and then something that might, if it had had more room to breathe, have been genuine feeling, something that touched, briefly, on the years and what they had held. She said, "Well, and then, I hope you'll be very happy." It was not warm. It was not meant to be warm, but it was civil, and it was the most honest thing Vivian had ever said to her, because it was the first thing she had said without any architecture built around it. Just the surface, just the words, and the meaning was neither more nor less than what they said. "Thank you," Amara said. And that was all. And it was enough. The wedding was small, which was what both she and Nathan had wanted. They were married on a Saturday in September, in the small church at the end of the park road, where the old trees were just beginning to turn at the edges, and the morning light came through the side windows in long, warm panels. There were perhaps 30 people. George was there, in his good jacket, sitting near the front with the expression of a man who is doing his best and means it entirely. Nathan's Aunt Margaret was there, a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who had greeted Amara before the ceremony with a brevity that Amara had immediately understood to be affection. Grace was there, at the back, in a dress more subdued than her usual choices, and she caught Amara's eye before the ceremony started, and gave her a nod that was small and sincere, and cost her something to give. Vivian was there. She had come. This was something Amara had not been entirely sure of, and she had prepared herself for either outcome, and when she saw her sitting in the third row with her back straight, and her expression set into a careful neutrality, she felt something that was not gratitude exactly, and not forgiveness exactly, but a version of both. The recognition that a person coming at all was a kind of honesty about what they were capable of, and that being present when it was not easy was something, even when it was not everything. She walked down the aisle with her father's arm through hers, and he was shaking very slightly, which she could feel, and she pressed her arm against his and felt him steady, and they walked together to the front of the church where Nathan was waiting, and he was looking at her with the face she had come to know as his most real face, the one without the social ease, without the pleasant surface, just the actual person, looking at the actual person across the short and enormous distance between them. She stood beside him. She heard the words of the ceremony and responded to them and listened to his voice, saying the same words, and heard something in his voice that she recognized because she felt it in herself, the seriousness of it, the weight of it that was not burden but ballast, the feeling of something real being done by people who understood what they were doing. They signed the register. They walked back down the aisle. The small gathered group of people who loved them, in their various degrees and their various kinds of love, were present and warm, and the morning light was on all of them. Outside the church she stood in the September air with the leaves beginning on the old trees and Nathan's hand warm in hers, and she thought of the rose wall at the back of the house she had grown up in, and her mother's voice singing quietly in the garden, and the journal under the bed, and the 10 minutes of morning quiet at the kitchen table that had been entirely hers, and the long, patient years of being told one thing and quietly knowing another. She thought of the morning she had heard her stepmother's voice over the garden gate, and the words that had traveled across the yard and reached her while she stood at the clothesline with her hands steady and her face quiet. Nobody will want a girl like that. She had heard those words and kept moving and kept her hands steady and gone on with the day, the way she had learned to do, the way she had always done. She had gone on with the day, and the day had gone on with her. And what the day had brought, what had followed from that morning and all the mornings before and after it, was standing beside her now in the September light, with a ring on her finger and a face full of the particular expression of a man who has exactly what he wanted, and is not confused about how fortunate that makes him. Nobody will want her, they said, and they said it loudly, and they said it to each other, and they said it to neighbors over garden gates, and they said it in the soft language of arranged seating at dinner tables, and they said it in the visiting cards they left at other people's houses, and they were very sure of it, for a very long time. But they had not reckoned on the morning. They had not reckoned on what the morning might carry. They had not reckoned on someone hearing, and turning around, and walking toward her rather than away. She squeezed Nathan's hand. He squeezed back. And the morning, as mornings do, went on.